Forgetting simple daily actions such as locking the front door, turning off the iron, or even switching off the stove can be a source of anxiety and self-doubt for many people. These moments are often met with frustration, and individuals might worry that such forgetfulness signals deeper memory problems. However, this kind of forgetfulness is not only common but also, in most cases, not an indicator of poor memory or cognitive decline. Rather, it is a consequence of how the human brain processes routine behavior, attention, and memory encoding. This text explores the neuroscience and psychology behind why we forget such everyday actions, unraveling the interplay of habit, attention, cognitive load, and emotional state that contribute to these gaps. The first step in understanding this phenomenon is acknowledging that memory is not a single process or system. It is a complex function involving different types of memory, each serving a distinct role in how we encode, store, and retrieve information. Memory is not like a video recorder that captures every detail of our lives. Instead, it is a reconstructive process shaped by attention, relevance, emotional significance, and repetition. Most people don't forget to remember something because their memory has failed entirely. More often, the brain never encoded the memory with enough detail to be consciously recalled later. To understand this better, we must consider the context in which these lapses in memory occur. People often forget whether they performed a routine action when they were distracted, in a hurry, or mentally preoccupied. In such moments, the brain relies more heavily on automated processes or habitual behavior to get through the task. If something is performed automatically, it may not be encoded with the conscious awareness necessary for later recall. This means that although the action may have been performed, we lack a vivid or retrievable memory of having done it. The phenomenon of not remembering whether we locked the door is rooted in how habits form and how they interact with memory systems. Many daily actions are repeated so frequently that they become habitual. Once a behavior becomes a habit, it is managed by parts of the brain that operate largely outside conscious awareness. The basal ganglia, in particular, plays a central role in storing and executing habits. This allows the brain to conserve energy by not engaging full attention for every routine task. However, the trade-off is that these actions often go unregistered in the types of memory that we can consciously recall. Multitasking and divided attention further compound the issue. If we lock the door while simultaneously thinking about the day ahead, responding to a message, or organizing thoughts about an upcoming meeting, our brain is spread thin. In such states, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for working memory and executive function, is overloaded. The memory of the door locking may never make it into the working memory buffer at all, let alone be transferred to long-term memory. The result is a feeling of uncertainty. Did we actually lock the door, or did we merely intend to? This brings into play the concept of prospective memory, which refers to our ability to remember to perform an action in the future, such as taking medication or sending an important email. It is highly susceptible to interference from distraction and stress. When prospective memory fails, we may forget whether we carried out the intended task. Adding to this is the illusion of memory, the belief that we did something simply because we often do it. The mental image of locking the door might seem so familiar that we believe we must have done it, even if we didn't. Stress, fatigue, and emotional overload are also major contributors to forgetfulness. These states impact attention, reduce cognitive flexibility, and interfere with the encoding of new memories. When we are stressed or overwhelmed, the brain prioritizes immediate threats or concerns, often at the expense of mundane but important tasks. It is no surprise then that memory lapses frequently occur during rushed mornings or emotionally taxing days. Another key factor is the gap between action and awareness. Performing an action does not guarantee that we are consciously registering it. Neuroscience shows that the brain can carry out complex sequences of behavior with little to no conscious involvement. These unconscious processes are efficient, but they do not always leave a trace in our conscious memory. Without the stamp of awareness, there is nothing for the brain to retrieve later. But this is not a hopeless scenario. There are cognitive strategies and tools that help bridge this gap between doing and remembering. Techniques such as verbal affirmation, unlocking the door now, creating distinctive cues, like placing your keys in a specific pocket only after locking the door, or even taking a quick photo can serve as cognitive bookmarks. These methods force a moment of attention and awareness into the process, making the action more memorable. In the following sections, we will explore in depth how memory works, how attention and multitasking influence it, the science behind habits and automatic behaviors, and practical strategies to enhance everyday memory reliability. We will look into the brain structures responsible for different types of memory, including the hippocampus, prefrontal cortex, and basal ganglia, and how their interplay determines whether we remember or forget. By the end of this exploration, it should become clear that forgetting to lock the door or turn off the iron is not a failure of memory, but rather a reflection of how the brain efficiently navigates a complex world of routines, distractions, and limited cognitive resources. Understanding these mechanisms is not only intellectually satisfying, but also empowering. It allows individuals to take control over their memory processes by implementing small but powerful adjustments to their routines and environment. The goal is not to eliminate all forgetfulness, an impossible task, but to reduce it to manageable levels through awareness, habit design, and attentional strategies. The very fact that we worry about whether we lock the door shows that we care, that we are engaged. The trick is learning how to work with our memory, not against it. Memory, in scientific terms, is the process by which the brain encodes, stores, and retrieves information. It is a foundational cognitive function, enabling learning, decision-making, and behavioral regulation. Without memory, we would be unable to recall past experiences, recognize familiar faces, or even perform daily tasks. Memory is not a single, monolithic entity. Instead, it comprises several interrelated systems that serve different purposes and operate through distinct neural mechanisms. At its core, memory can be divided into three main types: sensory memory, short-term or working memory, and long-term memory. Each type plays a crucial role in our cognitive function and contributes in its own way to how we process the world around us. Sensory memory is the first stage of memory processing. It captures raw data from our senses, what we see, hear, smell, touch, and taste, for an extremely brief period, typically just milliseconds to a couple of seconds. This memory allows us to experience a continuous flow of information, even though we are only consciously aware of a small portion of it. Sensory memory acts as a filter, providing a transient buffer that holds on to incoming data just long enough for the brain to decide whether it is worth paying attention to. Once the brain determines that certain sensory information is relevant, it moves into short-term or working memory. This is the type of memory we use for immediate tasks, such as remembering a phone number long enough to dial it, or holding onto a thought during a conversation. Working memory has a limited capacity and duration, generally allowing us to retain only about 7 items for a few seconds to a minute. It is an active process involving the manipulation and temporary storage of information. The prefrontal cortex is heavily involved in working memory, coordinating our attention and focus as we juggle information in real time. Long-term memory is where information that we deem important or that is frequently revisited gets stored more permanently. This type of memory can last from minutes to an entire lifetime, and has a much larger capacity than short-term memory. Long-term memory includes both declarative, explicit memories, such as facts, experiences, and knowledge, and non-declarative, implicit memories, like how to ride a bike or type on a keyboard. The hippocampus plays a central role in transferring memories from short-term to long-term storage, acting as a kind of neural librarian that indexes and retrieves stored information. These different memory systems work in concert, but are supported by various parts of the brain. Sensory memory relies heavily on the primary sensory cortices, which process input from the environment. Working memory is maintained primarily by the prefrontal cortex, while long-term memory involves a network of regions including the hippocampus, the medial temporal lobes, and various areas of the cerebral cortex where different types of information are stored. Memory is also influenced by emotional and contextual factors. For instance, the amygdala, a brain region involved in emotional processing, interacts with the hippocampus to enhance the storage of emotionally charged memories. This is why we often remember events that elicited strong feelings more vividly than mundane experiences. On the other hand, routine, low-emotion actions, like turning off the lights or locking the car, often fail to leave a lasting trace unless we make a conscious effort to register them. It is important to recognize that memory is not always accurate. Rather than being a flawless recording of our experiences, memory is reconstructive and can be influenced by expectations, suggestions, and current beliefs. We may unconsciously fill in gaps, or even remember things that didn't happen. This malleability is one reason why people often confuse doing something with merely thinking about it, particularly when the action is part of a habitual routine. Memory formation also involves synaptic plasticity, the strengthening or weakening of connections between neurons in response to activity. When we learn something new or repeat an action, the connections between relevant neurons become more robust, a process known as long-term potentiation, LTP. LTP is widely considered a cellular mechanism underlying learning and memory. Understanding the different types and mechanisms of memory helps shed light on why certain actions slip through the cracks of our awareness. The next step in our journey is to examine in greater detail how short-term and working memory function, especially under the demands of multitasking and distraction. These insights will help explain why we often forget simple actions and what we can do to improve our memory performance in daily life. To understand why we often forget simple, routine tasks, we must look closely at the brain's short-term memory system, especially working memory. Working memory is the mental notepad where we hold and manipulate information for a few seconds or minutes. It is essential for everyday activities such as solving problems, making decisions, or remembering a phone number long enough to dial it. But despite its importance, working memory is limited in both capacity and duration. This limitation is one of the main reasons routine actions can slip through our awareness. Working memory is centered in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, reasoning, attention, and impulse control. This area helps us stay focused on tasks and keep track of what we're doing in the moment. However, working memory can typically only hold about 4 to 7 discrete pieces of information at once. When we exceed that limit, by multitasking, being stressed, or distracted, information can be lost, often before it ever has a chance to move into long-term memory. For example, consider the act of locking your front door while simultaneously thinking about an email you forgot to send, your child asking a question, and your to-do list for the day. These competing inputs crowd the mental workspace. Even though you physically perform the action of locking the door, your attention may have been elsewhere, so the experience never had a chance to be consciously processed or encoded. Later, when you try to recall whether the door was locked, the memory simply isn't there. This interplay between attention and memory storage is crucial. Working memory requires attention to operate effectively. If our attention is divided, the brain may fail to register what's happening in the moment. That failure of registration, not retrieval, is often why we can't remember whether we did something like turn off the stove. It's not that the memory was forgotten. It never formed properly in the first place. One key distinction is that working memory is active, not passive. It doesn't just hold information, it manipulates it. This manipulation makes it highly sensitive to interference. Distractions, interruptions, and multitasking are forms of interference that degrade the quality of what we're trying to remember. You might walk into a room intending to grab your keys, but forget why you're there because your brain got sidetracked along the way. That's a classic working memory failure. The cognitive load theory supports this understanding. It suggests that we have a limited amount of mental bandwidth, and once that limit is surpassed, performance drops. When we juggle multiple tasks or stimuli at once, our brain has to choose where to focus. Automatic tasks like brushing teeth or locking doors don't demand conscious effort, so the brain tends to deprioritize them in favor of more novel or urgent tasks. As a result, they don't get a strong imprint in working memory and don't get transferred to long-term memory. Even more, mental fatigue plays a significant role. Working memory is susceptible to depletion. After a long day of decisions, stress, and mental juggling, our brain becomes less efficient at holding and processing new information. This is why people are more likely to forget routine actions in the evening or when they're emotionally exhausted. The working memory buffer simply doesn't have enough energy left to do its job properly. Another relevant concept is the serial position effect, which refers to our tendency to remember the first and last items in a sequence better than those in the middle. When multiple actions are performed in quick succession, like grabbing your coat, feeding the dog, turning off the coffee maker, and locking the door, the middle steps are more likely to be forgotten. If locking the door was somewhere in that middle zone, and your attention was elsewhere, the memory trace may be weak or absent. Importantly, there's also a time window in which working memory can hand off information to long-term memory. This is sometimes called encoding time. If you're immediately distracted after completing a task, like checking your phone right after turning off the iron, your brain may never consolidate the memory. The action was performed, but the memory is never stored in a retrievable form. Some people try to compensate for weak working memory by developing routines and habits. While this helps reduce the mental effort needed for daily tasks, it can backfire when people start functioning entirely on autopilot. Without conscious engagement, actions pass through working memory without leaving strong impressions. That's why a person might drive home without recalling the journey or eat lunch without remembering what they had. In summary, working memory is limited, fragile, and highly dependent on attention. It functions best when it's not overloaded and when distractions are minimized. Most memory lapses involving routine actions are not failures of long-term memory, but breakdowns in working memory caused by multitasking, distraction, and fatigue. In the next section, we'll examine how long-term memory works, how the brain decides what to keep, and why some things are never recorded in the first place. If working memory is the brain's mental notepad, then long-term memory is its filing cabinet. This storage system allows us to retain information for hours, days, years, or even a lifetime. It's what enables us to recall childhood memories, important facts, life skills, and deeply ingrained habits. But despite its vast capacity, long-term memory is not a catch-all. Not everything we do or experience gets stored, and this selectivity plays a major role in why people often can't remember whether they locked the door or turned off the iron. Long-term memory is more than just a place where experiences are stored. It is an active, dynamic system shaped by what we pay attention to, the emotional weight of an event, repetition, and context. The brain doesn't record everything. Instead, it filters what to keep based on perceived importance and relevance. Much of this filtering is handled by a brain structure called the hippocampus, a small, seahorse-shaped region located in the medial temporal lobe. The hippocampus acts like a librarian, sorting through recent experiences and deciding what gets filed away and what doesn't. When something is emotionally charged, novel, or strongly attended to, the hippocampus is more likely to convert it into a lasting memory. But when a task is mundane, automatic, or performed while distracted, the hippocampus may not encode it at all, or may store it so faintly that retrieval becomes difficult. This is why we might vividly remember a surprising conversation we had on the way to work, but have no memory of whether we locked the door, even though we did it right after. Encoding is the first step in forming a long-term memory. This process transforms a fleeting experience into a stable representation in the brain. But encoding requires attention and engagement. If you're rushing out the door while thinking about your next meeting, you're unlikely to encode the act of locking the door into long-term memory. That memory may exist in working memory briefly, but unless it's encoded properly, it disappears. Once encoded, the memory must be consolidated, a process by which the brain stabilizes it and stores it across various neural networks. Consolidation can occur over minutes or hours and is often aided by sleep. During sleep, especially deep, slow-wave sleep, the brain replays recent experiences and reinforces neural pathways, helping to solidify long-term memories. That's one reason sleep is critical for learning and memory. Importantly, long-term memory is divided into explicit, declarative, and implicit, non-declarative types. Explicit memory includes facts and events you can consciously recall, like remembering where you parked your car or what you ate for dinner. Implicit memory includes habits, skills, and conditioned responses, like knowing how to ride a bike or type on a keyboard without looking. These memories are formed differently and are stored in different areas of the brain. The hippocampus is crucial for forming explicit memories, especially episodic ones, events from your personal past. However, implicit memories, particularly habits and routines, are largely managed by the basal ganglia, a group of deep brain structures responsible for procedural learning and automation. Once a behavior becomes habitual, it shifts from hippocampal to basal ganglia control. This transition means that although the behavior continues smoothly, it may no longer be consciously monitored or remembered. This is why long-term memory doesn't always catch routine behaviors. If you've locked your front door in the same way hundreds of times, the act becomes procedural and unconscious. It stops registering as a unique event and may not trigger the encoding mechanisms necessary for long-term storage. Instead, it's folded into the background noise of daily life. The behavior is executed, but no lasting memory of it is formed. Another interesting phenomenon is encoding specificity. This theory suggests that we are more likely to recall information if the context during retrieval matches the context during encoding. So, if you lock the door while preoccupied and distracted, you may only be able to recall the memory if you are in the same mental state again. Since that mental state has passed, the memory may seem completely inaccessible, even though it technically exists in the brain. Furthermore, repetition plays a role in whether something becomes part of long-term memory. But mere repetition is not always enough. The brain prioritizes meaningful repetition when attention is engaged and the information feels relevant or emotionally important. Repeating something automatically or without awareness doesn't guarantee it will be stored. That's why habits, despite being performed over and over, can often be forgotten immediately after execution. Long-term memory is also reconstructive. Every time we recall a memory, we don't play back a fixed recording. Instead, we rebuild it based on fragments, influenced by current beliefs, suggestions, and context. This reconstructive nature makes memory prone to error, distortion, and gaps. It also explains why we sometimes think we did something when we only imagined or intended to do it. The memory of the intention can feel similar to the memory of the action. Finally, stress and emotional overload can block or impair long-term memory formation. When we are anxious or overwhelmed, the brain shifts into survival mode. It diverts resources away from encoding routine actions and focuses instead on perceived threats or pressing issues. This means simple actions like turning off the iron might go completely unrecorded because the brain was too busy dealing with stress. In essence, long-term memory isn't an all-inclusive database. It's a curated collection shaped by attention, significance, and neural pathways. Many of our routine behaviors never make it into long-term memory because they are too automatic, too familiar, or performed without conscious attention. These gaps are not failures of memory, but rather the brain doing its job efficiently, prioritizing what it thinks matters most. In the next section, we'll examine how automatic behaviors and habit memory allow us to function on autopilot, and how that contributes to the forgetfulness of everyday actions. Imagine getting into your car, driving to work, and arriving in the parking lot, only to realize you can't remember the journey. You were on autopilot, functioning without conscious thought. This kind of behavior is not rare. In fact, it's a fundamental feature of how the brain conserves energy and increases efficiency. The science behind this mental autopilot lies in what's known as habit memory, a form of unconscious, automatic action stored and executed by the brain's habit systems. At the core of habit memory is the basal ganglia, a group of structures located deep within the brain. This region plays a central role in procedural learning, motor control, and the automation of repetitive behaviors. When an action is performed frequently in a consistent context, like brushing your teeth every morning or locking the door before leaving, it becomes encoded as a habitual sequence. Once this encoding occurs, the brain can execute the action with minimal conscious oversight. This shift from deliberate to automatic behavior is incredibly adaptive. It allows the brain to offload frequently repeated tasks so that higher-level mental resources, such as attention and problem-solving, can focus elsewhere. Instead of using valuable energy and cognitive effort to think through each step of tying your shoelaces, your brain simply runs a pre-learned program. The same is true for locking the door or turning off the lights. However, the downside of this efficiency is that automatic actions often go unnoticed, and unnoticed actions don't leave a strong memory trace. Habitual tasks are often completed with such fluency and regularity that they barely register in conscious awareness. You may have locked the door, but because the act required little focus and no problem solving, the memory isn't encoded in a way that can be easily retrieved later. Instead of a vivid recollection, you're left with uncertainty. This is especially true when a habit is executed during cognitive distraction. For example, you may lock the door while your mind is occupied with a work issue or a conversation. In these cases, the motor system performs the habitual action, but your attention is elsewhere. The action is completed, but not tagged in your conscious awareness, making recall difficult. Researchers have found that habit memory can operate in parallel with conscious memory. That means we can perform an automatic action while our conscious mind is thinking about something completely unrelated. The basal ganglia don't need executive approval from the prefrontal cortex to perform a well-learned task. This autonomy allows us to function in complex environments, but it also means that memory for those actions may never reach conscious awareness unless something disrupts the pattern. A good example of this is the phenomenon of habit capture. This occurs when an established habit overrides a conscious intention. Say you intend to drive to a friend's house after work, but accidentally find yourself pulling into your usual route home. The habitual behavior captures your motor system, pulling you into a familiar loop. This demonstrates how powerful and automatic these patterns can be, and why we may struggle to remember deviating from or even completing them. Interestingly, habit memory is not easily disrupted by memory disorders that affect the hippocampus, such as Alzheimer's disease. Patients with such conditions may lose the ability to form new episodic memories, but still retain old habits. This underscores the fact that habit memory is governed by different neural circuits than declarative memory, further emphasizing why certain actions can occur outside of conscious awareness. Another important point is that habit strength increases with contextual consistency. The more often you perform an action in the same context, locking the door as you leave at 8 a.m. each day, the stronger and more automatic that behavior becomes. But this also makes it harder to distinguish one occurrence from another. If you perform the action every day in the same way, memories of each instance begin to blur. This makes it difficult to remember any single event clearly, including the most recent one. What's more, automatic actions often produce a false sense of memory. Because they are familiar and repeated, your brain may generate a general sense that the task was done, even when it wasn't. This is one reason why people sometimes leave the stove on or forget to take their medication. They feel as if they completed the routine because the mental image of doing it is so familiar. So, how can we disrupt this automaticity just enough to enhance memory without breaking the efficiency of our routines? One solution is to introduce a conscious cue, a small change in behavior that forces the brain to register the action more distinctly. For instance, saying aloud, "I am locking the door now," creates a moment of mindfulness and helps the event stand out in memory. Another method is to add a small, deliberate gesture, such as touching your keys to the door after locking it or taking a photo. These techniques provide a memory tag, a unique signal that makes the event more retrievable later. Additionally, experts suggest varying your routine slightly from time to time. This can break the blur of repetition and encourage more active awareness. While it may not always be practical to change your entire morning sequence, even a small shift, like switching the order of tasks, can make actions more memorable. Habit memory is an indispensable feature of the human brain. It enables us to function smoothly, save mental energy, and navigate life without having to consciously deliberate every step. But the same system that frees up cognitive space also limits our ability to recall automatic actions. Forgetting whether you lock the door is not a sign of a faulty brain. It's the natural outcome of a system designed for efficiency, not exhaustive detail. In the next section, we'll explore the division between conscious and unconscious behavior, how and why the brain sometimes operates on autopilot, and how that influences whether or not we can recall what we've done. Have you ever arrived home from work and realized you don't remember any details of the drive? Or put your coffee in the microwave and walked away, only to forget you did it moments later? These lapses are not signs of a failing memory, but of a brain operating efficiently by dividing labor between conscious and unconscious systems. To understand why we often forget routine actions, we must explore this division in greater detail. Human behavior is governed by both conscious, deliberate thought and unconscious, automatic processes. Conscious behavior involves active attention, intention, and awareness. It's what we experience when we learn a new skill, solve a math problem, or make a complex decision. This type of behavior relies heavily on the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for planning, decision-making, and conscious control. Unconscious behavior, on the other hand, consists of actions and responses that occur with little or no awareness. These can include everything from walking and typing to driving a familiar route or brushing your teeth. Once a skill or routine has been learned and practiced extensively, it often shifts from the conscious domain to the unconscious, freeing up mental resources for other tasks. This system of delegation is not only efficient but necessary. Conscious thought is a limited resource. We can only focus on a few things at once. If we had to consciously monitor every step of walking, breathing, or chewing, we would be mentally exhausted by midday. So the brain evolves strategies to offload repeated actions to the habit system, primarily involving the basal ganglia, allowing us to act without deliberate thought. The trouble arises when we try to recall whether or not we performed one of these unconscious behaviors. Because unconscious actions are not strongly registered in working memory or episodic memory, they are harder to recall later. The brain treats them more like background noise than foreground events. You may have indeed locked the door, but because the action occurred on autopilot, there's no vivid mental record of it. This is compounded by something known as perceptual decoupling, a state in which your attention is directed inward toward your thoughts rather than outward toward your actions. For example, if you're mentally rehearsing a presentation while brushing your teeth, your conscious awareness is not anchored in the physical moment. Your body performs the task correctly, but your mind isn't fully present. Later, when you try to recall the event, your memory draws a blank because attention was never fully engaged. Another contributing factor is the lack of novelty in routine actions. The brain is wired to prioritize new, surprising, or emotionally salient information. These elements activate more robust encoding processes in the hippocampus and the amygdala, increasing the likelihood that a memory will be stored and recalled. Routine behaviors, especially when performed in familiar environments, lack these stimulating features. Without novelty or emotional engagement, the brain doesn't flag the event as important, and the action fades quickly from awareness. Unconscious behavior also explains why people sometimes confuse intent with action. You might plan to take your medication and even picture yourself doing it, but unless the action was carried out with conscious focus, you may not remember whether it happened. The mental rehearsal of a behavior can sometimes feel similar to the memory of performing it. This phenomenon, known as source confusion, blurs the line between imagination and action. It's also worth noting that unconscious behavior can lead to errors of omission, forgetting to perform a task altogether, or errors of repetition, such as brushing your teeth twice or locking the door again 5 minutes later because you don't remember doing it the first time. These errors are common when routine actions are embedded within distracting or stressful situations. Because the brain prioritizes novel or urgent stimuli, routine behaviors can fall through the cracks, either being missed or misremembered. Interestingly, research suggests that mindfulness, the practice of focusing on the present moment, can help re-anchor behavior in conscious awareness. Mindful action increases the likelihood that a task will be encoded in memory. Even a brief pause to say, "I am putting the kettle on now," or "I am locking the door," can shift a behavior from the unconscious to the conscious domain. This small mental act gives the brain a reference point to retrieve later. The interplay between conscious and unconscious behavior also reveals why we tend to remember deviations from routine more easily. If you normally take the highway to work, but one day take a backroad detour, the novelty triggers conscious attention and creates a distinct memory trace. But when every morning follows the same path, the individual days blur together, and you're left unsure whether today's task was actually completed or just assumed. The challenge is not that unconscious behavior is bad, it's that it's unregistered. The brain does not allocate the same cognitive or neural resources to recording automatic actions. As a result, When we search our memory later, there's often nothing to find. This is not forgetfulness in the traditional sense, but a failure of conscious encoding at the time of the action. So what can be done? One strategy is to create intentional disruption, a small change that requires active decision-making. For example, if you always leave your keys in your bag after locking the door, switch to placing them in your coat pocket. That change will force a moment of consciousness and may help lodge the event more firmly in memory. Another approach is verbal labeling, also known as self-talk. When you perform an action, say it aloud or mentally narrate it. This creates a secondary encoding pathway involving both language and motor systems, making it easier to recall later. Lastly, keep in mind that operating on autopilot is not a failure. It's a highly efficient cognitive strategy. The key is learning when and how to step out of it, especially during tasks that are important or safety critical. It's about strategically choosing to be conscious at the right moments, not all the time. In the next part, we'll look more closely at attention and focus, how they shape memory encoding, and what happens when our attention is divided or misplaced during routine actions. Attention is the gateway to memory. It determines what gets noticed, processed, and ultimately stored. If you don't pay attention to something, your brain doesn't register it deeply enough to recall it later. This simple truth is at the heart of why people forget everyday actions like locking the door or turning off the stove. It's not that the memory failed. It's that attention never fully engaged in the first place. In the cognitive sciences, attention is defined as the mental process of selectively concentrating on one aspect of the environment while ignoring others. This ability allows us to prioritize relevant information and ignore distractions. However, attention is limited. You can only focus on a small amount of information at any given time. As a result, when attention is divided due to multitasking, distraction, stress, or habit, your brain may not properly encode the action into memory. Neuroscience shows that attention plays a crucial role during the encoding phase of memory formation. Encoding is the process by which perceived information is transformed into a construct that can be stored in the brain. If attention is present during encoding, the brain activates regions such as the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, which support the consolidation of that information into short-term or long-term memory. But if attention is absent or weak, the brain simply doesn't mark the event as something to remember. Let's apply this to a common scenario. You're leaving for work, running late, juggling your bag, keys, phone, and mental to-do list. You lock the front door, but you're simultaneously thinking about traffic, emails, and whether you fed the cat. Your brain is functioning, but your attentional spotlight isn't focused on the act of locking the door. Later, when you try to recall the moment, there's nothing concrete to retrieve because the action wasn't encoded with strong attention. This is not a matter of memory loss. It's a failure of registration. Like a photograph never taken, there's no image to develop because the shutter never clicked. Your brain did not perceive the event as significant enough to capture. What's more, research in psychology reveals that sustained attention, the ability to focus on a task over time, is especially vulnerable to routine. When a task becomes habitual, the brain relies more on automatic processes and shifts attention elsewhere. This means your awareness isn't present for the routine itself. As a result, even though the behavior is completed successfully, it doesn't leave behind a consciously accessible memory trace. In addition to routine, external distractions further dilute attention. A phone ringing, someone talking to you, or a sudden noise can instantly shift your cognitive focus. These attention shifts fragment your mental engagement and decrease the likelihood of successfully encoding ongoing actions. Internal distractions, such as intrusive thoughts, worry, or daydreaming, can be just as disruptive. The brain has a natural tendency to wander. In fact, Studies using functional MRI scans show that the brain often toggles between different networks. The task-positive network, engaged during active, focused work, and the default mode network, active during mind-wandering and self-referential thinking. When you're on autopilot, the default mode network tends to dominate, meaning your attention is turned inward rather than on the task at hand. A key concept here is inattentional blindness, a cognitive phenomenon where people fail to notice something obvious in their environment because their attention is elsewhere. This is not due to a visual or sensory limitation, but a mental one. If your attention is consumed by internal dialogue or external stimuli, your awareness of even simple actions can be blocked. Another related idea is change blindness, the failure to notice a change in your environment because your attention wasn't focused on the right part of the scene. These concepts highlight how much attention dictates what we actually perceive and remember. If you didn't focus on locking the door at the moment it happened, your brain may not encode it as a change or event worth remembering. Furthermore, emotional states can warp attention. Stress, anxiety, or fatigue pull cognitive resources toward emotional regulation and survival priorities. If you're worried about an upcoming meeting or upset over an argument, your attention is partially hijacked. As a result, your mental bandwidth is limited and routine actions receive only surface-level awareness. Improving attention requires both awareness and practice. One approach is to train selective attention, the ability to filter out irrelevant distractions and hone in on the task at hand. This can be cultivated through mindfulness meditation, which has been shown in numerous studies to improve attentional control and working memory capacity. Another practical strategy is to build attention cues into your environment. For example, creating a routine where you say aloud, "I'm locking the door now," forces a moment of attention. Or you can pause briefly and take a mental picture of your hand turning the lock. These small rituals trigger conscious attention and make the moment memorable. Even checklists can serve as external attention aids. Pilots, surgeons, and other professionals use checklists not because they're forgetful, but because they understand how attention can slip, even in high-stakes environments. A checklist doesn't rely on memory. It anchors the mind in the present and provides a structure for attention. It's also helpful to reduce cognitive clutter before completing a task. Try not to engage in multiple activities simultaneously when performing important but routine actions. Instead of locking the door while talking on the phone and thinking about your schedule, pause, complete the task with focus, then move on. In modern life, attention is a scarce resource, constantly under threat from technology, stress, and the fast pace of daily routines. But attention is also trainable. With intention and structure, we can protect and direct our focus where it matters most. In the next section, we'll examine how multitasking and cognitive load interact with memory systems, and why doing too many things at once is a recipe for forgetfulness. Multitasking is often viewed as a badge of efficiency in today's fast-paced world. We juggle breakfast while responding to texts, plan our day during the commute, and mentally prepare for meetings while brushing our teeth. But while we may feel productive doing several things at once, the science of cognition tells a very different story. Multitasking doesn't enhance memory, it weakens it. And it's one of the key reasons we forget simple actions like locking the door or turning off the iron. Multitasking is, in truth, a misnomer. The brain doesn't do multiple high-level tasks at the same time. Rather, it switches rapidly between them. This process is known as task switching, and it comes with cognitive costs. Each switch uses up attentional resources, adds transition time, and increases the risk of errors or omissions. When you try to simultaneously complete several tasks, the brain's executive control system, based in the prefrontal cortex, is constantly shifting gears, and as a result, none of the tasks receive sustained, focused attention. This is important when it comes to memory. As discussed earlier, memory encoding, the process of forming a lasting memory, requires attention. When you multitask, your attention is divided, and that weakens encoding. This is especially true for perspective memory, which is the ability to remember to carry out an intention in the future. If you're multitasking when you perform a routine task, like turning off the stove, your brain may not encode the action strongly enough to form a retrievable memory. Later, when you try to recall whether you did it, there's nothing vivid to retrieve. One of the most telling pieces of research in this area comes from studies on cognitive load, the total amount of mental effort being used in the working memory. When cognitive load is high, such as during multitasking, working memory performance suffers. The more tasks you try to manage simultaneously, the more likely you are to overload this limited capacity system, leading to forgetfulness, missed steps, and confusion between intent and action. Imagine you're preparing to leave the house. You're holding a cup of coffee, listening to a podcast, texting a friend, mentally rehearsing a work pitch, and checking the time. Amid all this, you go through your habitual motions. Put on your shoes, grab your bag, lock the door. Except, a few minutes later, a wave of doubt hits you. Did you lock the door? You remember reaching for your keys, but beyond that, the memory is foggy. That's because locking the door, which might normally receive a sliver of attention, was completely overshadowed by the other cognitive demands at that moment. This confusion is often due to the blending of intent and action. When your attention is scattered, the brain might encode your intention to do something rather than the action itself. So you might feel a strong sense of having meant to lock the door, but no clear recollection of actually doing it. This false memory, a product of cognitive overload, is a common side effect of multitasking. Multitasking also affects retrospective memory, remembering past actions, by degrading the context in which those actions occurred. Memory is context-dependent. We are more likely to remember something if the conditions under which we try to recall it match those during encoding. But when we multitask, we fragment the experience. There is no coherent context to draw upon, making it harder for the brain to reconstruct the memory later. The myth of effective multitasking is especially dangerous in the context of habitual actions. Habits are designed to run with minimal conscious effort. When you try to multitask during a habit, you amplify the likelihood that the action will be performed without registering in conscious memory. This leads to what's known as a habit slip, the moment you question whether you completed the action at all, even though you likely did. Scientific studies consistently show that performance and memory accuracy decline when people multitask. One experiment found that participants who were interrupted while performing a routine task were significantly more likely to forget whether they had completed it. Another study using brain imaging found that when multitasking, activity in the hippocampus, essential for memory consolidation, decreased, while activity in the brain's task-switching regions increased. In other words, multitasking deprioritizes memory formation in favor of juggling multiple demands. So what can be done to protect memory in a world that demands constant multitasking? First, it's important to recognize that true multitasking is neurologically inefficient. Whenever possible, aim for sequential tasking, doing one thing at a time with full attention. This doesn't mean slowing down every part of your day, but it does mean carving out pockets of intentionality for memory-critical tasks. One useful strategy is mindful sequencing, breaking your routine into a clear, deliberate order. For instance, always lock the door before grabbing your bag, and always say something specific aloud as you do it, like "door is locked." The consistency of sequence creates stronger associations, and verbalization activates additional memory pathways, including auditory and linguistic processing centers. Reducing background noise is another simple yet powerful tool. Turn off the TV, pause the podcast, or mute notifications when you're doing tasks that you often forget. This lowers your cognitive load and frees up mental bandwidth for attentional focus. Set deliberate cues. This can be as simple as placing your car keys only after locking the front door or sticking a sticky note on your coffee maker to remind you that it's turned off. These environmental anchors help force a moment of awareness even in the midst of a busy routine. Lastly, pause and check in. Just a few seconds of mental stillness, asking yourself, "What am I doing right now?" can re-engage attention and reinforce memory formation. These check-ins, while small, have an outsized impact on reducing memory slips due to multitasking. In sum, multitasking is a modern habit that works against our cognitive architecture. The brain is not designed to juggle many tasks while maintaining high-quality memory formation. When we try to do too much at once, we trade depth for speed and clarity for chaos. Understanding and respecting our brain's limits can lead to fewer moments of forgetfulness and greater confidence in our everyday routines. Next, we'll explore how stress, fatigue, and emotional overload affect memory and why those conditions make us especially vulnerable to forgetting simple but important actions. Forgetting whether you turned off the iron, locked the door, or took your medication is not always about habits or distractions alone. Often, the culprit is your internal state, how tired, stressed, or emotionally overloaded you are. These factors profoundly influence how memory works, especially when it comes to encoding and recalling everyday actions. Stress, fatigue, and mental overload don't just feel uncomfortable. They biologically alter how your brain processes and stores information. Let's begin with stress. When you're stressed, whether due to deadlines, conflict, or uncertainty, your body releases stress hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones are useful in the short term. They help you focus, react quickly, and handle danger. But when stress becomes chronic or too intense, it interferes with the very cognitive systems needed for memory. Under high stress, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for attention, working memory, and decision-making, becomes less effective. Blood flow and neural activity shift toward the amygdala, the brain's emotional center, which prioritizes rapid threat detection over rational thought. This shift is part of the fight-or-flight response, and while it can save your life in a crisis, it also disrupts your ability to concentrate on routine tasks. Locking the door or turning off the iron simply doesn't register as a high-priority task to a stressed brain, and the memory of doing it may never fully encode. Even short-term stress can impair perspective memory, your ability to remember to do something later. Studies have shown that people under time pressure or emotional distress are more likely to forget simple, intention-based tasks. For example, if you're rushing to leave the house for an interview, your mind is likely consumed by worry about your performance, not by mundane behaviors like turning off appliances. Fatigue has a similar cognitive effect. Lack of sleep affects the hippocampus, which plays a central role in forming and retrieving memories. Research shows that sleep deprivation decreases hippocampal activity, reducing your ability to create new memories and recall old ones. That's why after a night of poor sleep, you might find yourself repeatedly checking whether you locked the door or packed your keys. Fatigue doesn't just impact long-term memory, it also depletes working memory, which temporarily holds the information you need for immediate actions. When working memory capacity is low, you're more likely to drop or misplace details. That's why mentally exhausted people might forget whether they turned off the oven, even while standing right in front of it. Mental overload is another silent saboteur of memory. It occurs when your cognitive resources are maxed out, not from lack of sleep or emotional stress per se, but from simply trying to manage too many things at once. This is common in modern life, where individuals are constantly balancing work, family, errands, notifications, and background worries. When you're overloaded, your brain prioritizes tasks based on perceived urgency or emotional salience. Unfortunately, many essential but low-emotion routines, like locking the back door or setting the thermostat, are downgraded and managed by habitual systems. These don't engage strong conscious awareness, making it less likely you'll remember doing them. You may have completed the task, but your brain didn't allocate enough cognitive resources to form a retrievable memory of it. This is particularly true in emotionally charged or high-stakes situations. Imagine leaving your house in a rush after getting upsetting news. You might run through your normal routine on autopilot, but the memory of doing so is patchy or non-existent. Later, you might be unable to say with certainty whether you turned off the stove, even if you did. Your brain, overwhelmed by emotion, simply didn't encode the mundane action with enough clarity to recall it later. Even positive excitement can have this effect. Think of how often people forget simple things, like grabbing their wallet or checking the oven, while preparing for a vacation or big event. The excitement increases emotional arousal, which redirects attention toward the source of anticipation, not the everyday tasks happening in parallel. Importantly, stress and fatigue also impair metamemory, your ability to monitor and judge your own memory. When tired or anxious, people tend to be less accurate in assessing whether they truly remember something or are just guessing. This uncertainty can create a cycle of doubt. You don't remember doing something, so you assume you didn't do it, even if you did. So what can be done? The first step is awareness. Recognize that being tired or stressed makes your memory less reliable, and build your routines accordingly. You may not be able to eliminate stress, but you can adjust your strategies to work with your brain's limitations instead of against them. For instance, externalizing memory is a powerful tool. Use checklists, alarms, or written routines when you're under pressure. These tools take the burden off your internal memory systems. A checklist on the front door that reads lock, stove, lights, keys can serve as a visual trigger that reduces the risk of omission. Mindful moments can also help. Pausing for just 5 seconds to mentally register what you're doing. I am now turning off the iron, can create a memory anchor. Saying it aloud reinforces the memory through auditory encoding. It's a simple technique, but in moments of mental fog, it can make the difference between recalling and doubting. Sleep is another critical component. Prioritize consistent, high-quality sleep to give your brain the reset it needs to form and organize memories effectively. When sleep is sacrificed, memory precision suffers, and forgetfulness becomes more frequent. Lastly, managing emotional regulation plays a vital role. Breathing exercises, grounding techniques, or brief meditative pauses can lower cortisol levels, bring attention back to the present, and help reset your cognitive priorities. Even 1 minute of conscious breathing can shift you from reactive to reflective mode. In sum, stress, fatigue, and overload don't just make life harder. They directly impact your ability to remember simple, everyday actions. These aren't failures of character or intelligence. They're predictable consequences of how the brain reallocates resources under strain. By understanding this, you can better design your routines, build in safeguards, and give yourself some grace when memory fails. One of the most curious aspects of memory is that we can be completely convinced we did something, only to later discover we didn't. Or we might be sure we didn't do something, only to find out we had. This inconsistency, while frustrating, is not a sign of failure or dishonesty. It's a window into how memory actually works. The illusion of recall is a psychological and neurological phenomenon that reveals memory is not a recording device, but a reconstructive process. We don't play back reality. We recreate it based on clues, expectations, and habits. And sometimes, we recreate things that never happened at all. Let's begin with a simple example. You believe you locked the door this morning. You can even picture it. But halfway through the day, you start to doubt. Was that memory from today or from yesterday? Or maybe the day before? The mental image feels so familiar because the act of locking the door is routine. You've done it hundreds, maybe thousands of times. So when you imagine the act, your brain pulls from a stockpile of similar memories, all of which look and feel the same. This is the basis of source confusion, the difficulty in identifying where a memory came from. Did you really perform the action, or are you remembering the thought of doing it? In many cases, people confuse intention with execution. You meant to lock the door, thought about locking it, maybe even told yourself to do it. Later, your brain retrieves the intention but mistakes it for a completed action. This mix-up is common in both young and older adults, and is particularly likely when the task is habitual and the context is familiar. This is part of what's known as false memory, a memory that feels real but isn't accurate. In everyday life, false memories are usually benign, like misremembering whether you sent an email or turned off the coffee maker. But they demonstrate just how fluid memory can be. The more a memory is reconstructed, especially if we think about it repeatedly, the more it can be reshaped by belief, emotion, or suggestion. Memory illusion is heightened by habit repetition. When you do something the same way every day, your brain doesn't encode each instance as a unique event. Instead, it stores a generalized memory of the routine. This means that when you try to recall today's instance of locking the door, your brain may present a blend of previous instances rather than a distinct recollection. Because there's no clear sensory or emotional marker distinguishing today from other days, your mind fills in the gap with what usually happens. It feels like a memory, but it's actually a composite. A related effect is known as fluency illusion. When something comes to mind easily, we assume it's true. If you ask yourself, "Did I turn off the iron?" and an image pops up quickly, you might take that speed as a sign of accuracy. But quick recall isn't always trustworthy. The brain often serves up the most typical version of an event, not the most recent or the most accurate. Another factor behind memory illusions is the expectation of action. When we're in a routine, our brain creates predictions about what's supposed to happen. If you're about to leave for work, your brain expects that you'll grab your bag, lock the door, and head out. These expectations can lead to the formation of phantom memories, where your brain assumes an action was completed because it usually is. You might remember doing something merely because it's what you always do in that situation. Neuroscientific studies show that neural patterns for imagined and real experiences can overlap. The same brain areas that activate when you perform a task can also activate when you vividly imagine performing it. This neural overlap contributes to memory confusion. If the brain activity looks similar, your mind may have trouble distinguishing imagination from reality. This is especially true for actions involving motor routines, like flipping a light switch or turning a knob. Interestingly, some memory illusions are socially contagious. People can adopt false memories based on others' suggestions or even questions. If someone asks, "You turned off the gas this morning, right?" your brain might respond by creating a memory fragment that feels familiar, even if it's based on inference rather than fact. Repetition and social cues can strengthen these false memories over time, making them feel even more certain. Emotion also plays a role in memory illusion. When we're anxious or insecure, we tend to doubt ourselves more, which paradoxically makes us more susceptible to memory distortions. Anxiety fuels mental checking, going over past actions in your mind. And this repeated mental rehearsal can create vivid but inaccurate reconstructions. On the other hand, confidence, even if misplaced, can lead to false certainty about actions that never happened. The illusion of recall is not a flaw. It's a byproduct of how our brains handle overwhelming amounts of information. If we encoded every detail of every day with high fidelity, we'd be cognitively paralyzed. The brain simplifies, generalizes, and edits for efficiency. Most of the time, this works in our favor. But it also means our memory is prone to substitution, inference, and error. There are a few ways to manage this paradox. First, be aware that memory is fallible. The feeling of certainty is not proof of accuracy. Second, use intentional encoding strategies. For example, pausing and saying aloud, "I am now locking the door." This verbal cue creates a stronger, distinct memory. Third, rely on external memory aids, like notes, photos, or smart home devices that confirm whether something was done. These tools counteract the ambiguity of routine memory by providing concrete evidence. Understanding the memory paradox can help reduce anxiety. If you're someone who often second-guesses whether you did something, know that your brain isn't broken. It's just operating the way all human brains do. We trust our memories not because they are perfect, but because they're usually good enough. But when certainty matters, it's okay to use systems that don't rely solely on mental recall. In the next section, we'll look deeper into how habit affects memory encoding and why automatic behaviors are particularly vulnerable to being forgotten, even when they are performed correctly. One of the brain's greatest strengths is its ability to automate behavior. Repetition turns effortful tasks into effortless routines. This is incredibly useful. Imagine having to consciously think through every movement required to brush your teeth or tie your shoes. Instead, the brain saves mental energy by bundling repeated actions into efficient sequences. But this automation comes at a cost. When we perform habitual actions, we are often less consciously aware of them. Habits are stored differently from conscious memories. They are not encoded with the vivid detail of a novel experience. Instead, they are managed by a brain structure called the basal ganglia, which plays a central role in motor control and routine behavior. The basal ganglia is especially active when we perform learned sequences of behavior, things we've done over and over again. When a task becomes habitual, control of that task shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, which governs conscious decision-making, and toward the basal ganglia. The result is an action that unfolds with minimal mental effort and very little attention. This is what neuroscientists call automaticity, the performance of actions without conscious awareness. You might walk into your kitchen, make a cup of coffee, and leave the house without ever deliberately focusing on any single step. Your hands know what to do. Your body carries you through the motions. But because attention was never fully engaged, your brain doesn't encode the event in a way that allows for easy recall later. When you try to remember if you unplugged the coffee maker, there's no strong memory trace to retrieve. This becomes especially problematic when the habitual action is critical, like locking a door, turning off the stove, or taking a medication. We assume we did it because we always do it, and we usually do. But if we were distracted at the time, or if something broke the usual flow, say, a phone call or a sudden noise, there may have been a break in the habit sequence. And because the action wasn't encoded consciously, we may not even notice that we skipped a step. The more ingrained a habit is, the less likely it is to be consciously registered. When you first learned to drive, every movement required concentration. But after years of experience, you may arrive home with little memory of the drive itself. This doesn't mean you weren't paying attention to the road. It means your brain was operating on autopilot, relying on deep, well-rehearsed patterns to guide your behavior. The same mechanism applies to locking your house or shutting off appliances. You may do them correctly, but because the action is so embedded in routine, you don't consciously notice doing it. Studies show that repetition reduces the neural signature of awareness. The more often we perform a task, the less activation we see in areas like the prefrontal cortex. In contrast, novel or emotionally significant events light up wide regions of the brain, leading to richer, more retrievable memories. This explains why you remember your first time at a new job, but not the drive you took there on your 30th day. The process of chunking also contributes to reduced awareness. Chunking is the brain's way of compressing multiple steps into a single mental package. When you get ready for work, you don't consciously tick off each small action. You follow a script: shower, dress, grab keys, lock door. These actions are stored as a cohesive unit. If one piece of the script is interrupted or skipped, your brain may still assume the whole sequence was completed. Interestingly, people with high levels of conscientiousness, those who are generally careful and responsible, often experience more distress over forgetfulness in habitual tasks. This isn't because they forget more often, but because they are more likely to question themselves. In contrast, someone with a looser relationship to routine may not even notice a lapse unless it causes a problem. One of the key challenges of habit-based memory is lack of feedback. When you do something habitually, there's often no immediate sensory or emotional feedback to anchor the experience. Locking the door produces no noise, no distinct tactile sensation, no strong visual confirmation. Without these cues, the memory of the action is weaker, even if the action was performed. So what can be done? The solution is not to eliminate habits. They are essential for efficiency, but to introduce awareness into routine actions when memory matters. One simple technique is mindful labeling. When performing a key task, say aloud or silently what you're doing. I'm locking the door now. This act of verbalization engages the prefrontal cortex and reinforces the memory trace. Another strategy is to add a distinctive cue to the routine. For example, placing a brightly colored sticker near the lock and flipping it after locking the door adds a visual marker. You can also use reverse chunking, consciously pausing after each step to mentally check it off. This slows the process but greatly increases memory certainty. Technology can also help. Some people take a quick photo of the locked door or use smart plugs and devices that show whether appliances are on or off. While these tools don't change the brain's habits, they offer external memory support that's especially valuable when attention is thin or stress is high. Ultimately, the more automatic a behavior becomes, the less conscious oversight it receives. That's the paradox of habit. It makes life easier by removing the need to think, but also makes us vulnerable to forgetfulness. Recognizing this trade-off is key. It's not that your memory is faulty, it's that your brain is too efficient. You did the thing, you just don't remember doing it. In the next section, we'll explore inner dialogue and meta-memory, how self-talk and awareness of our memory processes can strengthen recall and reduce forgetfulness in daily life. One of the most powerful yet underutilized tools for supporting memory is self-awareness, specifically, our ability to think about our own memory processes. This self-monitoring is called meta-memory, and it refers to our knowledge and beliefs about how memory works, as well as our capacity to assess whether we are likely to remember or forget something. Coupled with internal dialogue, those conscious thoughts we narrate to ourselves throughout the day, meta-memory plays a critical role in reducing forgetfulness and increasing memory reliability in everyday life. When we perform routine tasks, we often do so in a state of partial attention. As discussed previously, this leads to poor encoding and a lack of retrievable memory. However, when we introduce intentional inner speech into the process, deliberately telling ourselves, I'm locking the door now, or I've turned off the stove, we shift the action from unconscious routine to conscious performance. This act of verbal labeling does more than just clarify the moment. It provides a cognitive marker that reinforces memory formation. Verbalization enhances encoding by engaging multiple sensory and cognitive pathways. Linguistic, auditory, motor, and attentional systems all work together when we articulate an action. This multisensory engagement strengthens the memory trace, making it more likely that we will be able to recall the action later. It also forces us to pause and direct our awareness to the task, even if briefly, creating a mental snapshot of the moment. Beyond reinforcing individual actions, inner dialogue supports metamemory by giving us a way to reflect on what we've done and how certain we feel about it. This can take the form of a mental checklist. Did I lock the door? Did I grab my wallet? Did I turn off the iron? Or a broader awareness of patterns, such as, I tend to forget things when I'm in a rush. These kinds of thoughts signal that the brain is monitoring its own performance, a higher-order function. Metamemory is part of what allows us to anticipate forgetfulness. For example, you might think, I'll probably forget where I parked, and so you deliberately look around and note a landmark. This is prospective metamemory, awareness of a memory you will need later. Alternatively, retrospective metamemory refers to evaluating the confidence you have in a memory. I'm not sure if I turned off the oven. These judgments, while not always accurate, guide how we act, such as whether we return home to check or call someone to verify. People differ widely in their natural metamemory skills. Some are highly reflective and constantly monitor their mental processes, while others act more impulsively and may not question memory lapses until it's too late. However, research shows that metamemory can be improved through conscious practice. Training yourself to mentally narrate key moments and reflect on your attention level can significantly reduce the kinds of everyday forgetfulness that plague even the most capable individuals. A key benefit of developing metamemory is that it helps you build memory confidence. Rather than second-guessing yourself repeatedly, you begin to trust your internal processes because you know you took deliberate steps to encode the memory. If you said aloud, I locked the door, and you remember doing that, you're less likely to feel uncertain later. That confidence reduces stress, which itself is another cause of memory interference. The brain is also more likely to remember actions tied to intentional decision points. For example, instead of locking the door mechanically, you can pause and say to yourself, I am choosing to lock the door now. The use of intentional language signals to the brain that something important is happening. It gives the action a sense of priority, which improves the likelihood of encoding it into memory. Another important aspect of metamemory is knowing when your memory is likely to fail. This could be time-based, e.g., I always forget things when I'm tired. Task-based, I tend to forget if I close the garage when I'm on the phone. Or emotional, when I'm anxious, I can't remember if I took my meds. Recognizing these vulnerable moments allows you to preempt them with strategies such as note-taking, reminders, or checklists. Interestingly, people who struggle with memory in one area may be very effective at using metamemory tools to compensate. For example, someone with ADHD might rely heavily on verbal affirmations and visual reminders to maintain routines. These strategies don't fix memory per se, but they support it by building a scaffolding of conscious cues. There's also a growing body of research into the use of metacognitive training, exercises and interventions designed to improve awareness of one's own thinking. These might involve journaling, mental rehearsal, mindfulness practices, or even apps that prompt daily reflections. The goal is to build a more accurate and intentional relationship with one's memory processes. One common mistake people make is assuming that remembering should be effortless. But memory, like any system, works better with attention and support. Cultivating inner dialogue and metamemory isn't about being obsessive or overanalyzing every action. It's about developing a helpful mental habit. like checking your rearview mirror before changing lanes. It takes a second, but it can prevent serious problems. In practice, you might start by narrating 1 or 2 critical actions per day. You can also set aside 30 seconds after completing a task to mentally review it. Did you really turn off the stove, or did you just think about it? Did you see yourself do it? The more often you ask these questions, the more fluent you become at identifying whether a memory is based on real experience or just intention. Metamemory becomes especially important in high-stakes environments. Surgeons, pilots, and safety inspectors often use verbal protocols to reduce error, not because they lack memory capacity, but because they understand that even experts can forget when distracted or under pressure. By saying each step aloud and monitoring completion, they create a mental and auditory trail that's easier to follow. In daily life, the same principle applies. Whether you're locking your front door, taking medication, or turning off an appliance, introducing conscious awareness through inner dialogue can make the difference between confident memory and nagging uncertainty. And as metamemory improves, so does your ability to anticipate challenges, deploy strategies, and reduce unnecessary worry. In the next and final part, we'll explore practical strategies and scientifically supported methods you can use to improve memory reliability, especially for routine tasks that are most vulnerable to forgetfulness. Now that we understand the complex interplay of memory systems, attention, habit, and emotion in everyday forgetfulness, the final step is to explore practical solutions. While it's unrealistic to expect that we'll never forget whether we locked the door or turned off the stove, it is entirely possible to reduce such lapses. By applying specific, science-based strategies, we can strengthen memory encoding, reinforce awareness during routine actions, and create reliable cues for later recall. One of the most effective strategies is mindfulness, the practice of deliberately focusing your attention on the present moment. When we carry out habitual tasks mindlessly, we often fail to encode them in memory. Mindfulness encourages a shift from autopilot to conscious action. Instead of locking the door while thinking about your to-do list, you intentionally direct your attention to the feeling of the key in your hand, the sound of the lock, and the act of walking away. Another highly effective tactic is verbal affirmation, which we touched on in the previous section. Saying to yourself, "I'm locking the door now," engages both your verbal and attentional systems. It creates a distinct moment in time, anchored by language. This simple habit not only reinforces the memory trace, but also gives you a verbal cue to recall later. It's a minimal effort strategy with a high reward. Checklists and structured routines are particularly useful for people who struggle with memory under pressure or during multitasking. Pilots, medical professionals, and engineers routinely use checklists to prevent critical errors, not because they're forgetful, but because they understand that human memory is fallible, especially under stress. In daily life, similar tools can be used. For example, creating a leave the house checklist, keys, phone, wallet, stove off, door locked, can help anchor your morning routine. Over time, the checklist itself becomes part of the habit and reduces reliance on fallible recall. Visual and tactile cues can also support memory by linking actions to sensory experiences. If you have trouble remembering whether you took your medication, placing the pill bottle on top of your phone or turning it upside down after taking a dose can provide a visual indicator. Likewise, if you lock the door and then place your keys in a specific pocket only after locking it, the position of the keys becomes a cue that the action has been completed. These if-then routines help bridge the gap between action and memory. Some people benefit from photographic or digital reminders. For example, taking a quick photo of the locked door, the turned-off oven, or the closed garage can serve as concrete proof. This method may sound excessive, but it can be a highly effective solution for those who suffer from anxiety related to memory gaps. It provides an external validation of internal actions, which can be calming and useful, particularly in high-stress periods. Setting reminders through apps, smart devices, or alarms can also help ensure that important tasks aren't forgotten. While this approach is often associated with time-based tasks, like appointments or deadlines, it can also be applied to routines. For instance, setting a daily alarm labeled "check stove and door" before leaving the house might sound redundant, but it externalizes responsibility and reduces the cognitive load on your working memory. The use of habit stacking is another powerful approach. This strategy involves linking a new memory-supporting behavior to an existing habit. For example, if you always drink coffee before leaving the house, you might decide that as soon as your coffee is finished, you'll run through a memory checklist. The association helps reinforce the new behavior without requiring a complete lifestyle change. A helpful mental strategy is mental time travel, visualizing yourself performing the task and imagining how it feels. Athletes and performers use this technique to reinforce muscle memory and reduce mistakes. Similarly, if you tend to forget whether you unplugged the iron, pause after the action and mentally replay it. See yourself doing it. Feel the plug in your hand. Hear the click. This form of guided imagery strengthens the neural representation of the event. When possible, avoid multitasking during critical habitual actions. Try not to lock the door while checking your phone or take your medication while engaged in a conversation. These kinds of distractions pull attention away from the task and interfere with memory encoding. If you must multitask, try to complete the critical task first with full attention before returning to the secondary activity. A broader, long-term approach involves improving your overall cognitive health. Sleep, nutrition, physical activity, and stress management all play roles in memory performance. Chronic sleep deprivation, for example, significantly impairs attention and memory consolidation. Regular aerobic exercise has been shown to increase hippocampal volume and improve memory function. Managing anxiety and stress through breathing exercises, therapy, or meditation can also reduce memory failures caused by emotional interference. Repetition and rehearsal are also useful. While most people assume that habitual actions don't require practice, periodically rehearsing critical routines, especially during transitions like moving to a new home or starting a new job, can help stabilize them in memory. This doesn't mean doing things robotically, but rather reinforcing consistency during times of change, when routines are most vulnerable to disruption. Finally, it's important to develop a non-judgmental attitude toward forgetfulness. Everyone forgets things, and the occasional lapse does not mean your memory is weak or deteriorating. In fact, many memory errors are signs that your brain is functioning efficiently by automating repeated tasks and filtering out unnecessary detail. The key is to be aware of when that efficiency becomes a liability and to put scaffolding in place where it matters most. By combining these strategies, mindfulness, verbalization, external cues, routine building, digital aids, and health practices, you can create a resilient memory environment. Not every strategy will work for everyone, and the best approach is often a combination tailored to your personality and lifestyle. But the consistent thread among all of them is intentional awareness, bringing consciousness into actions that are otherwise unconscious. In the final section, we'll bring all these ideas together and reflect on why everyday forgetfulness is less about memory failure and more about how we use, and sometimes misuse, our brain's attention and automation systems. Forgetting to lock the door, turn off the iron, or complete other simple daily actions can feel unsettling, even alarming. People often interpret these lapses as evidence of failing memory or cognitive decline. But as we have explored throughout this text, Such forgetfulness is usually not a sign of poor memory. Rather, it reflects the interaction between memory systems, attentional focus, habitual behavior, cognitive load, and emotional state. In most cases, the memory of an action wasn't lost. It was never fully formed or consciously encoded in the first place. The brain is not a flawless recorder of daily life. It does not store every detail of what we do, particularly when those actions are routine, low stakes, and performed in distraction or haste. Memory is selective, shaped by attention, emotional salience, and the perceived importance of an experience. When we carry out habitual actions while mentally elsewhere, our brains often rely on automation to get the job done efficiently, but without forming strong or accessible memory traces. Habitual behaviors are largely governed by the basal ganglia, which allows us to perform complex tasks with minimal conscious effort. This is a strength. It frees up mental space for higher-order thinking. But it comes with a trade-off. The less attention we give to a task, the less likely we are to remember it later. That's why we can drive home on autopilot, but forget where we parked or why we walked into a room. At the same time, our working memory, the system responsible for temporarily holding and manipulating information, is easily overloaded. When we are multitasking, stressed, or fatigued, our ability to process and encode even simple actions can falter. We may believe we locked the door, but what we recall is often the intention to lock it, not the action itself. This confusion between intent and action is at the heart of many memory lapses. False memories and memory illusions also complicate matters. Because routine actions are so familiar, the brain can fabricate memories of having done them, even if we didn't. These mental shortcuts can help us move through life efficiently, but they can also lead to misplaced confidence or nagging uncertainty. Fortunately, once we understand how these systems work, we can support them more effectively. Strategies like mindfulness, verbal affirmation, and the use of visual cues allow us to insert conscious awareness into automatic behaviors. Checklists, routines, and habit stacking reinforce memory through structure and repetition. When we acknowledge the brain's limits without judgment, we can create workarounds that reduce error without adding stress. Ultimately, the key insight is that everyday forgetfulness is normal, even inevitable. It arises not from laziness or carelessness, but from the brain's balancing act between conscious focus and automatic function. In a world filled with distractions, speed, and mental noise, the occasional lapse in memory is to be expected. Rather than fearing it, we can adapt to it with awareness and smart cognitive habits. We learn to recognize the signs of overload, to respect the importance of attention, and to take simple steps that make memory more reliable. The question is not whether you will forget, but how you can design your life to forget less and to feel more confident in the memories that matter most.